Oh, there it is.
Why are you running?
YouTube, hello, welcome back. Wanted to show you guys the ultimate spear build and why it's too good. I'll be going over armor, skills, and stat points, and even show you your combos and openers for each type of enemy. There will be chapters for anyone trying to get info fast as well. Also, a little tip for anyone that doesn't know, and this is important to understand going forward, but dealing damage to an enemy's back actually gives you a 50% damage increase. And not only that, when an enemy is exhausted, meaning their stamina bar is empty, you deal another 50% damage. So altogether, whenever you're attacking the back of an exhausted enemy, your damage goes up 100%. Okay, so if you're not in New Game Plus, that's alright. I'll be showing you what skills and armor to take that you'll have access to, and afterwards, I'll be going over the New Game Plus stuff as well. For non-New Game Plus, you'll get a ton of value out of the Fallen Lord set. Not only is there a few neat tricks that you can take advantage of with this armor, but it also looks super sick. Also, if you've collected enough Jarlings, you can get the Jarling helmet that gives you -1 set requirement and allow yourself to add accessories that give you 20% back damage and the warrior set for spirit gain, or you can even go with the pilgrim set to increase the damage of the potent blows, which also includes the full moon attack. You could take 2 of any of those sets basically. The reason we're taking this set is because we're going to be taking advantage of Spiral Thrust's insane damage. The set gives Spiral Thrust a damage boost and even offers a way to get even more value out of one of the strongest attacks in the game, which is Full Moon. The skills you're going to be looking for are here. The reason you're pretty much filling out this entire side is because Moonlight Stance offers so much extra damage and utility, basically powering you up a ton. It also gives you access to the almighty powerful Full Moon attack, which can easily break most enemies' stance because absurd amounts of stamina damage, and the damage itself is no joke. Plus, it costs no spirit whatsoever to use it. The other reason we love this side of the skill tree is because of this skill here, Crimson Strike, which allows you to get even more damage out of your brutal attacks so that you're really maximizing your damage output, and even more so when you have the skill Moonlight Wrath. The reason we're investing into the Spiral Thrust is because, just as the description says, we got extra damage during certain moments of a fight. The description doesn't do the best job of wording here, but Spiral Thrust will work both when the enemy is exhausted and after the brutal attack as well, in the same combo essentially. I'll expand more on that when we get into the combo portion of the non-New Game Plus section of the video. But another skill that contributes a massive amount to not only chaining together really sick combos, but it also gives you a sizable damage buff whenever you hit an enemy with it, is the trance skill. The requirement to using the skill is having to use a skill before it, but at its final level, you will be able to use this after any attack, so it won't burn through your spirit points. Landing this skill on an enemy will give you half of the spirit used back, and also gives you a damage buff on top of that. The skill also plays a big role during some of your combos and openers, so it's a must-have. You also want to take advantage of the skill Shadow Reversal, so that whenever you break an enemy's stance or when they're exhausted, you'll be able to instantly get behind them and be able to do way more damage, especially if they're exhausted, as you'll get 100% more damage and be able to do a full guaranteed combo. Another skill we're very interested in is Shadow Strike. The damage of this skill is okay at best, but there's way more reasons why this skill is amazing. Whenever you use this skill at the same time an enemy attack is coming at you, you'll gain a bunch of advantages. 1 is taking 0 damage, that's nice. 2 is being able to basically warp to the enemy's back without having to even break their stance. And 3, if you manage to use this skill after you've already received a damage buff from things like your trance skill, then this skill's it will buff the damage and duration even more. It will also buff the duration of your Moonlight Stance too, as well as any other skills that fall into this category. And don't forget, the skill Crimson Strike deals extra damage based on the duration of your Moonlight Stance. So by increasing its duration, you'll see even more insane numbers pop up on your screen. There's obviously more skills here, but most of them are just good stuff that you'll most likely want to have. Now, with all that, let's go ahead and show you your combos. When dealing with a tanky enemy, it's important to get your Moonlight Stance activated immediately. You could try to smack them with your swift attack enough times until you go into Moonlight, but this method will usually result in you getting hit, or even having to dodge and block an incoming attack, making you have to input additional strikes before it can go off. So, instead, we have a couple of better options. The first, and one of my favorites, is actually kind of hard to pull off until you get used to it, but it's really helpful as it lets you shortcut into the final attack of your Swift Strike, which gets you Moonlight. The way to do it is by dashing forward and holding the direction away from the enemy, then pressing any attack, preferably your Swift attack, followed by a Swift Strike. The reason this happens is because if you do a neutral dash, your character will dash backwards, and the Swift attack from that dash direction results in this particular upswing, which lets you immediately go into the final strike of your Swift Strike. But since this will often put you at an unfavorable distance from the enemy, you'll usually not land the strike and you won't go into Moonlight. So instead, we're making the game recognize that we're inputting a dash attack, but we're manually choosing the directional attack. This method is super helpful as you'll find yourself positioning just outside an enemy's attack range on purpose to avoid them from interrupting your attack, and basically starting the fight with Moonlight Stance being your opener. The other method is much easier to pull off, but does require spirit to use, and that is simply using your trance skill and doing a swift attack after it. This skill unfortunately does require either another skill or attack being used first before it can be used, and in most cases, using a skill first to get this started is pretty wasteful, but luckily you can just simply toss a swift attack out from a distance, use this skill, then land your swift attack for Moonlight Stance. It's not the worst option since you get a damage buff if the skill hits an enemy, but you're also hedging your bets that you'll be uninterrupted for the most part. This isn't a bad option throughout a fight. In fact, it's the optimal option during a fight in most cases, but as an opener, it's less effective than doing the trick I showed you earlier, but still an option for anyone that has difficulty pulling it off. Okay, moving on. Now that we have Moonlight and all its wonderful buffs, you have a ton of options at your disposal. You can start your potent combo string, and if that breaks an enemy's stance, we're able to pretty much warp behind them and dish out mega damage. You can also start with Full Moon to deal a ton of HP and stamina damage at the start, but be aware that each time you use Full Moon, your Moonlight Stance loses some of its duration based on how much skill points you put into it. At this point, if they're nearly beaten, you can throw in some more Full Moons or any other attacks to finish them off, but if they still have a ton of HP, such as bosses, then this is where Spiral Thrust begins to play a major role. Once the boss's stamina is nearly broken, we're making sure we're in Moonlight Stance and that we have our damage buff from Trance. Once it's completely broken, we want to make sure we're behind them using Shadow Reversal. Then we use a charged Spiral Thrust. If there's remaining time before the brutal attack timer ends, we can toss in a couple extra hits, maybe even our trance skill to make sure we have our damage buff. Then, just before the timer ends, we'll do our brutal attack, and immediately after, we'll follow up with another charged Spiral Thrust for maximum damage. Remember, the damage of this Spiral Thrust is being enhanced due to the effects in the skill tree. We're getting extra damage done to enemies that are exhausted, and extra damage to enemies after we've done a brutal blow. This combo does cost 4 spirit in total, 5 if you include using the trance skill, but most times I don't use it there since I'll have it already applied beforehand. It's not too hard to generate 4 points of spirit by the time, say, a boss is ready to have their stamina broken, so if this is done correctly, you'll do massive amounts of damage. The last thing I'll mention, and maybe I'm repeating myself, but against stronger enemies and bosses, you mainly want to make sure Moonlight is active and that you're gaining your damage buff before the enemy is exhausted. Now this part even took me a while to get the hang of, but if you also involve the counter skill Shadow Strike to increase our damage and duration even higher just before we get them to their exhaust state, we'll be able to do even more. But that's mostly just something to keep in mind, since it can be pretty mind flooding to try and implement that all the time. So for the most part, you can just use this as a counter attack that lets you get behind the enemy for free. Just know that by doing this all correctly, you'll be slaughtering bosses instantly. Here's some footage to better explain this. Here's the damage without the counter applied, but tons of remaining time on Moonlight Stance. Here's the damage with the counter, but I took too long to do the brutal strike before the damage buff ran out. And here's the damage if you quickly do the brutal strike before the buff runs out. So the main takeaway is if you do it perfectly, you'll net the most damage, but the main thing you want is to ensure that Moonlight has as much duration as possible to make things simple and still net you the most damage. Last but not least, before we move on to the new game plus stuff, your stat points and your armor attributes for your stats. I know everybody is very different. I've seen people with 15 points into health and 99 into stamina. I've seen 99 health. I get it, and to each their own, but obviously this is an ultimate build video, so I'll be giving you the ideal distribution, and you can make adjustments that help you feel more comfortable. Your main damage stat should be getting most of your points, and your health should be getting enough that you're not dying from a single combo. Any more than that isn't really necessary. I recognize stamina is a major thing in this game, and I won't blame you for putting a lot of points into that as well, but I promise with this set and its damage output, you'll be able to mow down most of the stuff you encounter in this game by just focusing on increasing the weapon's damage and giving yourself a decent amount of stamina to use that damage. Also, using the very first ghost you get in the game is very overpowered, so I'd recommend that one as well. As for armor attributes, you mainly want stamina recovery rate, raw damage increase, and damage reduction on armor. Now, onto our New Game Plus set. In New Game Plus, a bunch of new stuff gets added, which one of them would be the fixed attributes on epic gear. If you watch the non-New Game Plus stuff, you'll already be familiar with the set we used, and might be pleasantly surprised to see that this gear now makes everything we used even stronger. By all means, if you like that set and that playstyle at this point in the game, you should still be totally fine to take on the harder content, but there are some sets that manage to get us even more value. I've tried many, and ultimately I found the Faded Memories set to be the strongest. The main thing about this set is the new passive it gives you, which empowers your potent strikes to deal more damage and chain together endlessly. The set offers a large amount of stamina, and even the helmet gives you a ton of stamina anytime you do a successful brink dodge, giving you a massive tank of stamina to really let this new attack fly. First, we'll go over the skills. I did talk about a lot of these skills in the non-new game, so if you skip to this, but you do want to understand why they're good, then simply find the chapter on the skills from earlier and you should be set. Anyway, Moonlight Stance, still super good, and don't be afraid to remove 2 points from Full Moon if you'd like, since we'll rarely use this attack. It's still good, but we have a much stronger and more reliable way of attacking now. That's up to you. Spiral Thrust is still amazing, but ironically, we won't be using it the same way we were in New Game Plus, or sorry, non-New Game Plus. This skill is more of a gap closer and a way to regenerate stamina simultaneously. It also does phenomenally against shielded enemies when fully charged. Also, Moonlight Stance Wrath is still incredible. 0 Point is okay, but there's a case to be made about removing it, which I'll explain in a bit here. Shadow Reversal, Trance, and Shadow Strike are all must-haves. Vital Strike is great for this build in particular, and Eagle Wind is more of a nice to have, but it does have great HP and stamina damage along with a high stagger. I'll show you my current common skills, but I feel like these are mostly preference. The most obviously OP one is the new skill we got for getting into New Game Plus, and that's Battle Thirst. You need this, and there's no exceptions. Now, I'll explain the combos and how we can continue taking advantage of our empowered potent blows, even as we're dodging attacks. These are going to be separate methods, but this doesn't mean we should just stick to one. We want to be able to use our empowered attacks as much as possible. So, after we dodge an attack and do our dash strike as many times as needed until we finally get our opening, our next attack can be a fury skill or vital strike so that we can go right into our empowered attacks after. If you time your counter skill, this lets us basically begin our empowered attacks right into the enemy's back. Another method is to just allow the Shadow Reversal skill to go through after a dash attack and continuing to use our empowered right after. This can sometimes be the optimal method whenever this results in us taking the enemy's back. Our final method is just use your empowered potent blows whenever you're in a neutral stance. However, some enemies make it difficult to just use your empowered attacks right out of the gate, or even make it hard to just swing it more than twice before you have to dodge something again. But that doesn't really matter since it does so much HP and stagger damage anyway. There will be times it's better to just throw a couple swift attacks in, since you're likely going to dodge again right after the first attack of a lot of the later bosses. But whenever you see the opportunity to really swing, that's when you want to really start throwing those potent blows. It's worth mentioning that you'll still want a solid combo when dealing with tougher enemies or bosses, and the method is fairly simple. Anytime you see the enemy's stamina bar about to break, we want to open with Trance. You have to use any attack to be able to use Trance, obviously, so I usually just toss a Swift Strike out there if I'm not already mid-combo. So, Swift Strike, Trance, Swift Strike. This gives you Moonlight Stance. Then, Shadow Reversal. You'll take their back, and then simply start smashing your potent blows button until there's little remaining time left for a brutal strike. And if you like, you can even throw in a charged spiral thrust since it's gaining increased damage for a short period after a brutal strike. Most times, after the brutal strike, I like to just use Trance. It's a nice little gap closer. It refreshes the damage buff, and it allows me to use one swift attack to put me back into Moonlight, since Crimson Strike removes Moonlight Stance after use. Here's a couple super valuable tips to finish us up on the combos. We went over what to do when the boss or the big enemy is near break, but in the scenario where you're already doing your potent blows and that's leading towards them breaking, then the most optimal thing to do is to get behind them as soon as possible to get maximum damage. This is when we want to use Shadow Reversal. It's much easier and faster to do this without the skill 0 Point, since it has the same buttons that you need in order to activate Shadow Reversal from this specific combo. So removing 0 Point can oftentimes make it easier to get to the back faster and net much more damage. This was also worth noting, even though we went over how you should use your trance skill to prep for the break because two reasons. One, is that trying to judge how many more hits we need for the break to occur isn't the easiest thing to do in the middle of a fight. So it's nice to be able to have a unique alternative. And 2, similar to 1, we may just not be paying enough attention at times and totally missed our opportunity to use trance, which is fine. But if the enemy is broken already, then instead of using trance and refreshing Moonlight, it's much more value to just get behind them as quick as possible with your shadow reversal during the break and start pummeling them with your empowered potent blows. Also, if you're still getting familiar with New Game Plus, now that we have Battle Burst in our common skills, we can take advantage of this set's main damage stat, which is doing potent blows while enraged. Enraged just means whenever your stamina is below 50%. So the trick here is to actually find yourself below 50% stamina, and while doing your potent blows, occasionally use your fury skills to give yourself some stamina, so you can stay in that sweet spot below 50% as much as possible. Do note though that trance does not allow you to regain stamina like the other skills for whatever reason. As for stat points, fairly similar to non-New Game Plus, we are maxing out our damage stat, giving our endurance a fair amount of love, our HP enough to not get one shot by most things in the game, and our secondary damage stat will get the rest. For your armor attributes, you will want some raw damage, but mostly percent damage increase. I know potent blow damage seems appealing, but your skills also do a ton of damage, as well as your brutal strike, so believe it or not, universal damage is best here. You also want stamina recovery rate, and for defensive stats, anything should be fine that makes sense to you, unless you're really min-maxing, then frontal damage and damage reduction seems to be the best. By the way, I do stream on Twitch, the link is in the description below, if you want to swing by, ask questions, or just say hello. And please, if you like the video, a thumbs up is greatly appreciated as it does help a ton. Consider subscribing if you want to see more videos like this, and I do hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Peace.